everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce Tim Sweeny. Tim, welcome back to California. Tim is well known to almost all of you, probably. He did his graduate work at Northwestern. I don't know if we have any Northwestern representation this week. We did last week. Hopefully we will this week too. And then he did a postdoc at Berkeley. And since, I don't know, for the last 7 years, is this right, Tim? 7 years, you've been a professor at Denver University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Tim back to California virtually, and welcome to all of you from around the world. It's wonderful to see all of you. Couldn't be happier to see so many faces. Tim, thanks for agreeing to give a talk for all of us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dave. Let me start the screen share. We all good?
How many parts are
there? Slides, excellent. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me back. It has been 7 years. That's kind of nuts. So I thought I would just make this pretty informal, and I thought that I would share work that I've been doing for the last, I guess, 6 years, things that I'm really excited about, and something maybe a little bit different than I thought that you might be seeing at this lab meeting, just to shake it up a tad. Oops. Hold on 1 second. Great start. I went to my last slide, the thank you slide. Great. Hold on 1 moment. All right. Okay, better. All right, so I thought that I would talk about social and visual interactions when it comes to seeing crowds. We know, of course, we all know. I'm sorry?
Can you share your screen?
I thought that I had. Oh my gosh. How are we now?
Good. There we go.
Good. All right, great. Excellent. Okay. So let's do this. All right. So as mostly vision scientists in this room, we know that some perceptual processes are strictly visual, not social, nothing about. For example, perceiving an edge is social as far as I know. This is a retinal process and an early cortical process. Perceiving color is not really a social process, or just seeing a line's orientation. These are all things that we know to be purely visual. Some perceptual processes are contextual, meaning the way you see one thing depends on what else is nearby, what the context is, and many of those processes are only visual as well. So for example, when you see a line in the context of a nearby line, due to lateral inhibition, the orientations of those two lines might appear to be different from each other. And like I said, that is a visual process. Or even when we see lines nearby other lines due to crowding, which we probably all know about, it's hard to see this target line's orientation. It's hard to discriminate then when it's alone. And these are all processes that we're familiar with. But some perceptual processes are contextual and appear to be visual, but guess what? Maybe they're not. So for example, seeing large sets of objects is one such process. Vision people know that to make sense of collective properties of sets of objects like this, It's not that hard. You can make sense of, say, orientation or length. What's the average length of all these lines, or average color, or where's the center of mass, or you name it. I don't care. Fill in the blank here. What's the variability of the set in terms of who knows what? Probably the visual system can do that, and that's a visual process. It seems strictly visual, but that may only be because you're not looking at a quote social process. If we talk about social cues, maybe things change. Summary perceptual processes might allow you to make really more complex social judgments that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And so that's what I want to focus on today. How can we use visual processes to understand more complicated social judgments? And going in the opposite direction, how can we use what we know from social psychology to change the kinds of questions that we ask using our vision science methods? So for example, what's the average biological motion of this crowd? That's maybe a visual process. What's the average speed? You could say that's visual too. What's the average emotion? All these things we know. How about, is this crowd unified, or are they fractionated? Do they have the same values? How do you know that these people have the same underlying core values and goals, shared emotion? Are they a group? Are they just a collective of people, or are they actually a group of people that share something cognitively? And beyond that, is this your group? When you look at a crowd of people, how do you decide whether that's your group or your squad or whatever the hell you want to call it? And then last, what is this guy's deal? Check him out. I don't know where this picture comes from. I don't even remember where I got it. I think I found it on the internet 7 years ago, and I still haven't figured out what's causing all these people to panic. They're clearly panicking, right? But what is this guy doing? I don't know what he did, but I kind of feel like he's the mastermind behind all this, just watching all of this stuff unfold. He did it. All right, so I'll pause here and I'll give you a little bit of context. I gave a variation of this talk at a social conference last February. I was invited out to give a talk at a little symposium about group processes, and I was the only vision person there. And it was really cool. I had a lot of fun with it. And part of that fun is because everything you say is new when you go to a social conference, and you can share what we're doing from the vision science end of things, and people are very receptive to it and excited about learning new ways of asking questions about groups. And so you get totally different questions. I was really nervous going into the talk because, I'm not a social psychologist. If you don't know me, I'm not a social psychologist, and I'm not pretending to be one. And even before my talk, I sort of stopped everybody and said, look, I'm not a social person, so I'm probably going to be missing some classic theory that everybody should know about. And if I am, I'm sorry, but please tell me, But I just wanted to go there and make connections and kind of update my thinking, maybe come up with some new ideas. And I found that people were super welcoming and really excited about starting collaborations. And it turns out that there's social psychologists have been asking questions about groups for a really long time. If you go back to really old work by Turner and some other people, they ask, what is a group? And they propose what we know as grouping mechanisms to be the thing that determines what a group of people is. It's shared values, but then you have to see those shared values and deduce that those people, based on their appearance, share some unified cognition. And so they proposed way back then that there should be some visual cues that allow people to make a quick, what a social psychologist would call a thin slice judgment of a crowd of people. And then it kind of got put on the back burner for like 50 years. And social psychologists have been thinking about what groups are and studying group processes, how people behave in groups, not necessarily how they see groups, but what they do in groups, while maybe ignoring the the fact that there should be a visual mechanism that allows you to see a group and understand it. And they sort of assumed that, okay, there's got to be this visual process, but we'll leave that to vision people to figure out. And we're going to focus on what happens after you figure out, hey, these people share some value. But now, especially in the last 5 or so years, I've found social psychologists have become super excited about figuring out what that visual mechanism is. And so it's been a really productive new line of work for me to start working with social people and changing the questions I asked. And so that's why I'm giving this talk today. I want to share that enthusiasm with you and show you how I've tried to make that connection and sort of maybe lay out a framework for you to do something similar, if you wish, or not. All right. Also, by the way, if you're curious, I'd be happy to answer any questions about what it's been like for me trying to get grants from social panels and present at social conferences and try and publish papers in social journals. It comes with its own set of challenges, which is cool, but also tough sometimes. All right, so ensemble coding. How does it work? Well, we know the visual system has a process to see groups. And one way that we could see groups is through sort of like a deliberate, slow cognitive introspection. So to perceive where this flock of birds is headed, you could just pay attention to the direction of individual birds, one after another, until you've got an idea of the overall direction of the group. But this sort of like focused serial inspection approach, we know just isn't ideal. It takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort. So instead, the visual system has this specialized mechanism for seeing sets of things rapidly as a collective. This is ensemble coding or summary statistical perception. And we can use this to pool and compress information about lots of people or things or whatever into a summary representation so you can sort of see the gist of what the group is doing and understand their average. All right. There are lots of studies on ensemble coding. Most of them are visual at this point, but more recently, some examining social features like power and dominance and hierarchy and stuff like that. All good papers, and I'm not going to list all those here. That would be kind of silly, I think. We have lots of review chapters, some of which have been written by people in this virtual room. So you know what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to review that. And I thought, well, what could we talk about? Where's this field going next? And I thought, well, one option is to catalog all the visual and social features that could be ensemble coded. So, you could ask, well, I don't know. It seems like almost every visual thing has been cataloged at this point, but pick some random social feature. Can that be ensemble coded? Probably. I'd venture a guess and I'd say, yeah, but that's not really what I'm interested in. Meanwhile, I think a lot of people are now looking at what's the mechanism of summary perception, and there's a lot of cool stuff coming out on that too. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. I want to examine how visual mechanisms and social judgments interact with each other. So this is going to be at the broad level, I'm going to provide some examples of how vision and social psych can be effectively paired. I'm going to review 3 of my most recent investigations, and if I have time, I'll jump into a 4th one. I'm going to have sort of a familiar framework for all of these presentations, all of these investigations. So I'll start by describing something that we already know from one field. And then I'm going to pose a question that requires integrating social and visual cues, something that we can't do with one field alone. And then I'm going to share some data that provide an example of how we do that. I'm going to be a little bit light on the data and stats. I'm not putting that in there because I just want to keep this sort of surface level and broad strokes. But if you have any questions about specific design details or anything like that, just stop me, okay? All right. Okay, so one study, this is something that we started in my lab. This was the first project I started when I came to Denver, so this is super old. It's with a former grad student of mine, Ulrich Elias, and what we knew from social psychology is that people who form a group are just not not just people who are close by each other, not just a bunch of faces on the screen. They're people who share values, some belief. And people in a group also tend to behave together in real time, dynamically. And we thought, okay, well, if ensemble coding is useful for summarizing social cues, then it should be really good when these group level cues are at their strongest, when the visual features of the world tell you that, hey, this collective of people is a group and they need to be considered as one. So we had this hypothesis that crowds that behave together dynamically should be processed at the summary level with more precision than a collective of people that don't behave together at the same time. We created a face set for this, so we just took some neutral expressions and we morphed them with fearful, happy, and angry expressions like you could see here. And we just sort of interpolated there, and then we did a little norming just to make sure that the morph intensities were linearly matched with perceived intensity, and they were for all of our different expressions. So the face set was all right. We had faces from white men, black men, and those were the faces we used in this particular study. Different identities as well. All right, so for every crowd, we created a group of 12 faces, and for copyright reasons, I don't want to go to jail, but I can't show you the actual faces here from the NimStim set. So here's 12 faces, all right? And on every trial, the crowd has an emotional mean. So it could be like a little angry, let's say emotional intensity here means anger intensity. They could be angry, happy, or fearful. So here this group shown by this distribution is a little bit angry at the start of the trial. Every single face has a slightly different emotion. As the trial goes on, it's about 1 second. The emotion, the intensity of each face scales up. It moves around. So here, halfway through the trial, the faces are now more intense. And then once they hit sort of the end point of the range, then they sort of bounce backwards. And now they start becoming less angry or less happy or whatever the intensity is, whatever the emotion is for that trial. The key thing here, though, is this is a synchronous crowd. So even though the faces are changing their intensity, they're changing their intensity in the same way. All the faces are becoming happier. And then when they're not becoming happier, they're becoming less happy all together as a group, like they're reacting to some shared thing out there in the world, some shared event. On every trial, an observer adjusts a single face to estimate what the average emotion of the crowd was across that 1 second presentation. And then we get the error of their response on every trial. So either too positive, too negative, whatever. And across several hundred trials, we get a distribution of errors. And we calculate the standard deviation of the error distribution. And the more narrow the error distribution is, naturally, the better a perceiver that person is. So precision of perception is noted here by low SDs of error distributions. And on the synchronous trials, there's data. Now, is that good or bad? And it's kind of hard to tell because there's no control condition yet. So we had to have a separate condition in which we had the crowds, and the crowds were dynamic. But in this case, the crowds were not synchronous. The faces were not adjusting their intensities in the same way. So here in an asynchronous crowd, the mean emotion starts off at the same spot, but then as the trial unfolds, individual faces in the crowd start sort of doing their own thing, right? So some of the faces get happier, some of them get angrier, and they sort of diverge, and they hit the endpoints, and they bounce back and forth just like a bunch of little dots. What's that game? Oh, there was I can't think of it. There's like this old Atari game that looks like this. All right, anyways, so.
Clarification real quick on this, just
Yeah.
to be understanding here. So, because you showed a circle, a circular emotion distribution, and then here you're plotting this linearly, like 0 to 100.
Yeah.
So what is 0 here?
So good question there, anonymous stranger. Thank you. So 0 is neutral, right? And on any trial, the emotion stayed within one category. So this could be an anger trial. And then they just stay within neutral to 100% angry, and they stay within that category. Nobody ever goes past the category boundary.
I got you, but then you're picking 3 different categories and you're presenting stuff from within those?
Yeah, so on a next trial, it could be happy or it could be fearful. And in the response stage, they could go all around the wheel. And so we had to look only at classifications that were categorically correct. So this became sort of problematic. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, can I ask a clarification question?
Sure.
So in your sets of faces, you varied identity as well as emotion simultaneously, is that right?
Yeah, and race too, but I didn't show you that.
So how did you determine what the ground truth is if you're mixing identities like that? Like, what is the correct answer?
Well, one way to calculate that would be the numerical intensity of each. So each face has a value across time. And so you just get the average of all of those faces at all of the time points across the particular trial. And it's true that like maybe one identity's 45% anger seems more intense than some other face's 45% anger. So we had an alternative analysis where we instead based the emotion scores and the responses based on the perceived intensity of the faces from the face set from the norming experiments. We asked people how intense are all the different faces from the morph set. And so we could recalculate based on perceived intensity rather than the physical morph space. And I'll just tell you the results come out exactly the same when we do it that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is that what you were asking about, more or less? Couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry, yes, thank you, Tim.
You said yes. Okay, cool. All right, so we have this asynchronous crowd, and the faces are just doing their own thing. And if people are just accurately, picking some faces, or all of them, let's say, and then just keeping track of all of them individually and then calculating the mean, this shouldn't mess people up. And yet when you look at their error distributions, people are much worse at this. And you could say, well, maybe so, but we know that people are less good at calculating the mean of a set that has more variability. And as you can see here in the second panel of the figure, the asynchronous crowd, once they start doing their own thing, you have more variability within this crowd. So maybe that's the result here. We did another control condition where we had, I'll make like a little normal distribution here. And the distribution itself, the shape of it would stay the same and it would move around and bouncing around the category boundary here. And then within that distribution, you have individual shapes or faces kind of bouncing around, but they never leave the distribution. So the mean and the SD of the distribution as a whole stays the same, but each face is kind of still doing its own thing. And I'll tell you now the results stay the same there too. So this pattern of results is not about the variability in the crowd. It's about the fact that when the faces are moving synchronously, something about that group compels a perceiver to encode their mean with more precision than otherwise. And then we had I guess I wouldn't call it a control condition, it's more of a just for fun, what the hell condition where we had a single face from the set. And presumably this would be really easy, right? The single face just changes intensity, you track it and report the mean of it. And it turns out that people aren't actually that great at this. They're better with a synchronous crowd than just reporting the mean of a dynamic face across a whole second. So there's something about the synchronous group that affords you this extra precision.
Tim, I have a question for you. Subjectively, in the asynchronous condition, presumably you've seen these stimuli a lot. Do you get a more disjointed sense of the set of faces? Do they seem less coherent?
Yeah, they totally do. Thanks for asking that, Gideon. When we built this stimulus set and we put a trial, we put a couple of trials together, just how we do, just to see how things are going to work out. And this is going to sound arrogant. I don't mean it this way, but when we just ran a couple of trials, we looked at each other and said, oh my God, this thing's going to work. I know it's going to work, because you could just tell just looking at it. And it's a grouping cue, I think. just as any other grouping cue would be obvious to an observer on a single trial. I think this kind of fits with that. And you know, there have been some other studies showing that grouping gates the precision of ensemble coding too. And ultimately, I think that this is like that in a way. I suppose you could say, well, you know, okay, we're just talking about grouping influencing the precision of ensemble coding. Are we not even talking about a social cue? Maybe it's just a basic visual process acting on a social cue with a visual dependent variable. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. All right. So that's it for that investigation. This was just sort of the beginning, because it had hints of social stuff in it, but it wasn't explicitly social. And this isn't exactly the kind of question the social psychologist would ask, but it gave us a taste for how we might go in that direction. And so we came up with some new ideas based on this experiment to more explicitly go after social questions. But before I jump into a new study, does anybody have any other questions or thoughts they want to share? Okay. All right. So now we thought we would go in the opposite direction. Instead of taking a social question and then motivating a vision experiment, we thought we would go in the reverse direction. We know that when people see sets of objects, they can extract subgroups from those sets. So like if there's a set of different size objects and have different colors, you can extract different subgroup means from those sets. Well, we thought maybe people can use that subgrouping process to make judgments about groups of people and then change the beliefs that they have about those groups of people. So the question is, can perceivers use subgrouping through ensemble coding to learn about racial category boundaries and inform their schemas about social groups using visual processes? And this is a paper with some collaborators here at DU, Sarah Lamer and Michael Dyer and Max Weisbach. So here's the design. We show a set of 12 faces really fast, 300 milliseconds. And there's white men and black men in the crowd. And on every trial, the observer adjusts a single face to match the mean emotional intensity of the set. So just like the last task, pretty much. And we had different emotions. Don't worry about the emotions. They don't really matter so much here, but we stayed within one category like before. And it was a between subjects design. So we had a control condition in which, okay, you had two separate subgroup means. You had a subgroup mean of emotional intensity for the white men and then for the black men. And their mean emotion, as you can see, was, the subgroup means are close to the superset mean. So they're reacting as if they have the same sentiment. And sure that the faces of the black men are a little bit more emotionally intense, but they're pretty close. And then the other set of subjects, we had this, what we call the emotional segregation condition. Now here, the mean, we had all kinds of different means, but the subgroup means are quite different from each other. So if you're paying attention and you're really perceiving these subgroups well, you would realize that the white subgroup is less happy than the black subgroup. We didn't tell anybody anything about this explicitly. We just said, here are some faces, tell us what the mean of the faces are. And I'm not going to share the ensemble coding data with you, but I can just tell you that people do it pretty well. We verify that they're using multiple faces to make these judgments. They're very precise. So people were doing ensemble coding on this task. But what was more interesting to us was what happened to the way people thought about racial groups after about an hour of doing this task that they really didn't have any idea why they were doing it. So they're sitting there making these judgments about white men and black men, either as collectives or not. And then when the task is over, we give them a surprise test. we created some new faces. 7 of them were white, 7 black, and 7 biracial faces. And we gave them a race categorization task. We asked people to just indicate whether that person that they're looking at is biracial. So this is a whole new task, different set of faces. And what we find is that when people had been looking at sets of white men and black men reacting differently for an hour, they were less likely to report that a biracial face was actually biracial when they saw it in this test later. Less so than the control condition. So just an hour of learning implicitly that white people and black people react differently, even within the same category, just different intensities of expression, changed how likely you were to say that a person would be racial. And what this sort of suggests is that, you know, this is a perceptual judgment they're making right here, right? But it tells you something about what somebody might believe about race at its core. Can somebody be biracial, or do you just see people to be one or the other? We had a more, I guess you'd call it a more social judgment. We had a second task, and it's the task of what's known as race essentialism. The task has all sorts of questions. You read these statements, like here's an example statement. Racial groups are primarily determined by biology, as in like, if you're white or black, that is who you are based on your biology, and that's it. And people have to rate how much they agree with these different judgments on a 7-point scale. And consistent with the perceptual task, we find that people who see white and black people reacting differently are more likely to endorse these really broad, sweeping statements about the biological nature of race, which is, I don't know, either good or bad, depending how you want to look at it. Like, kind of scary that just an hour of priming and seeing this information can change the way you feel about people in a fundamental way. But you could also look at it as the reverse. Maybe it's easy to undo those sorts of thoughts with an hour of priming of a group of people acting the same way. People are pretty quick learners, and they seem to use ensemble coding to make these judgments about not just what a group is doing, but who those people in that group are at a really fundamental level. Another interesting thing we found was that we looked at the precision of people's ensemble estimates, and we found that the people who were really bad at ensemble coding, the people who were really bad at ensemble coding were the people who reported that racial groups were really different. In other words, if you're good at ensemble coding and you could see everybody collectively and then report their superset mean, you are also less likely to produce responses saying that black and white people are fundamentally different. I don't know.
Something,
go ahead.
Thing that I'm curious about. Did you ever try coming back like a week, a month later and test how enduring those differences were?
No, we didn't, but that would have been sick. That would have been fun. Yeah, I mean, did the effects wash away, or did we instill like toxic beliefs about race in these people and say, you know, get out of the lab, you're good, have a nice day?
Bring them back now, 3 years later, and it's still there.
Right. I don't know. I mean, I like I said, you could see this as a positive or negative thing. I mean, it could be like a brainwashing tool to really change the way people believe about things. I was honestly surprised that this experiment worked. Like, I guess I can admit that. That's okay. But, you know, it could work for a whole host of other things too. Who knows?
Tim.
Yeah.
I'd just say, I think the results are really impressive, especially if they endure, if you can somehow follow up with that. Just because I feel like social psychologists have been working on all sorts of interventions to try to reduce bias or make people more aware of their own privilege. And there are very few interventions out there that have been shown to be effective, even in the short term. So it's I mean, I don't know what the effect size or how meaningful these differences are in real world terms, but I think it's a pretty cool result, especially if you could demonstrate it having a more long-lasting impact.
Thanks. Yeah, I think possibly too. To be honest with you, these are pretty small effects. They're significant, but we ran a lot of people. I can't remember the end, but it's, you know, not surprisingly quite large. And but the other thing is that we were showing people emotional responses from the same category. So it's like, if white and black people are reacting differently, well, it's just a difference in intensity of like 10 points or something like that. But if, I mean, just, you could really go in the opposite direction and have categorically different emotional reactions and produce huge results. So yeah, I think that there's some power here potentially, you know.
Tim, in the biracial judgments, what was the emotional intensity, or where on the wheel were these biracial images presented?
Oh, did you ask about the intensity?
Yeah, so in the biracial judgments, they're making judgments on novel faces.
Mm-hmm.
Where were those novel faces on the intensity wheel?
Oh, the emotional intensity wheel, they were all neutral.
So could any of this be accounted for by a bias of closeness to what the underlying segregation intensities were?
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Could you expand on that a little bit?
So if in the emotional segregation, say the white faces are less intense, just in that subject or in that block of trials, and now I show a biracial face that is neutral, presumably it's closer to the white faces than it is to the black faces.
That would have been a real problem. Across trials, even within one individual, the white and black faces were always counterbalanced. So on one trial, the white faces could be more intense, and the next trial they're less intense. So that shouldn't have been an issue.
Got it.
But I bet they would learn that over time too, you know, probably.
Tim, one other question on that. Roughly what range of JNDs were there within a given face? You know, what from neutral to extreme? Did you have your rough estimate of like how many JNDs the range was?
I think I know from a different experiment, it's a couple of morph points. So the JND is probably like 2 or 3. And then the means were about, the difference in the subgroup means in the control condition was about that. So they would have seen a subtle difference there probably. But in the segregation condition, it was more than a couple of JNDs, I believe. So.
Okay. And did each racial category of faces have the same range in terms of from 0 to max had the same JND range?
Well, roughly, yeah. I think people were better maybe perceivers of, let's see here. I think the happy expressions might be perceived to be a little bit more intense. So like a max happy face.
I guess I'm asking if like the white person, the black person maybe had a wider dynamic range, and then you're comparing between the sets, could that have influenced you know, what they consider a biracial face to be?
Yeah, probably actually, you know, now that I think about it, yeah. There's a lot of work showing that people are more quick to associate anger with black men. And so we didn't equate them in that way. And we didn't measure a whole lot about people's race essentialism going into the task. We only measured it afterwards. And so I don't believe that the amount of race essentialism they produced at the end had a whole lot to do with their precision of judgments earlier, but yeah, we didn't equate it in those terms though. And there's probably, you know, to be honest, there's probably some difference across races in the set in terms of perceptual discrimination differences. Yeah.
Thanks.
Shall I move on? Let me see anything. All right, cool. All right. So I've shared experiments that that illustrate perception of crowds, but you have nothing to do with those crowds. The perceiver has nothing to do with the crowds that they're judging. And so it's all pretty abstract. But ultimately, when you look at a crowd of people, you know, the big question that you probably want to answer is this my group? Are these my people? Can I go interact with them? Do we share values? Are they like me? Are they not? This is my squad goals or whatever Jason Fisher would probably say, right? Now you're paying extra close attention. All right. So we wanted to ask a question about judgments of your own membership in a group and how that relates to ensemble coding. We know that people are really good at looking at a group and extracting the mean and standard deviation and some other stuff about sets of faces. So that's pretty easy stuff. Can perceivers use these mean and SD stats at the same time to make a judgment about a crowd and their own membership in that crowd? That was the next question. And to do this, I teamed up with Amit Goldenberg, who was at Stanford, now he's at Harvard, and James Gross, who's still at Stanford. Actually, this was sort of fun. They reached out to me after that dynamic crowds paper, the first investigation, and they wanted to start doing stuff. So we just started talking about ideas. And after a couple of months, we sort of hammered out this program of work. I've actually never met either of them in person, which is kind of weird. We've been working together for like 4 years now. Who knows? Okay. So Amit is sort of an expert when it comes to, he is an expert when it comes to group categorizations and people making group decisions based on political image. So he had all these horrible images of Americans doing terrible things. And we put this to use by showing these images to people. I've blurred them out, but here are some, it's a blurred out image of that Abu Ghraib prison mistreatment that happened several years ago. And so we show these terrible pictures to subjects and we ask them, how do you feel about it, right? And we ask them to adjust a face using a slider to indicate their amount of anger or moral outrage or whatever you want to call it to a series of pictures. And they see a whole bunch of these pictures and they indicate, okay, on this particular trial, this is how mad I am, all right? And we tell participants that there have been other people in this experiment too. And there were, what do you know, 12 people just like you did this experiment recently. And here are their reactions to that image. And as you can see, there's various amounts of anger in this set of faces. And presumably these are the reactions of 12 other people who did this task just like you. And here's how angry they are. And then you make a joke, or I mean, you make a response. Are these people in your group? Were those people your group or not, based on their response to that image? So at its core, a very simple design, right? But we were a little bit sneaky and deceptive. We based the crowd's emotion on the participant's response from just a moment ago on every single trial. So you can see that, you know, we varied the mean emotion. We kept the mean to be the same, or we let it differ from the participant's response. And we varied the amount of variability in the crowds as well. So here's an example. Let's say I was medium angry about that image. Well, we could show you a group of faces where the set had the same average anger. And overall, the people in that group were pretty unified in their anger with a little bit of variability. Or maybe they had the same mean anger as you, but there's a lot of variability in that group's anger, right? So there's 2 crosses there. We had another condition in which variability was low, but the mean was different than yours. And so here, it's a pretty tight-knit group in the reaction, and you're the outlier. You're the extreme person. They're all less angry than you. Or you're closer to the mean, but in this case, there's a lot of variability within this group. So we had these 4 different kinds of sets. And what we were interested in was how your endorsement of, is this a group or not, is this my group, varied as a function of these 4 different crosses of mean and SD. And we actually ended up with some surprising results, but this ain't one of them. So here's the most boring thing I'm going to show you today. What we found is first that when a crowd had a mean emotion that was close to your reaction, you were more likely to say that these people are part of your group, which is fine, and that makes sense. And it's actually not that big of a difference there. You'd think it would be a lot bigger than that. It wasn't. But people are sensitive to that. Okay, let's move on. Another interesting thing we found is that regardless of whether the mean is the same or different, people like to think that they're a part of a group with low variability. If the crowd has low variability, regardless of what the mean is, you're going to be more likely to say, hey, these are my people. People want to, I don't know if they want to be part of cohesive groups, but they're more likely to say that they are part of cohesive groups. There's something appealing about a group of people who have some shared ideology, and you kind of want to join that group, which is weird and a little creepy. But that's not the really interesting thing here. So what's really interesting, at least to me, I don't want to tell you what's interesting, but what interested me was what was going on in this different mean condition when the group had a different mean than what you said. Check out the rightmost bar here. So here you have the group has a different mean than you. You're the red dot, all right? And if that group has very little variability, you're more likely to say, that's my group, even though you are the outlier. You're the furthest response from the mean of that group. And yet you're more likely to say you're part of that group than if, now look at the third bar to the right, you're closer to the group mean. So it's a different mean than you, but if the group has variability, you're less likely to say you're part of that group. So what this basically means is people use ensemble voting, they use the some statistics they get from these groups, mean and variability, at the same time in an interactive way to make a judgment about whether or not they're part of that group, but they don't do it in a way that you might expect.
Hey, Tim, did you control for the maxima and minima in this one? So let's say this person picked a high value in their response. Is it possible people are responding based on the lowest value of the alternatives? So are people just saying, does the set, is the extreme opposite of mine far from mine or close to mine?
Oh, I see. So that you responded extra angry, and then you look and you see that there's somebody else who responded, but not too far from you. And so you're not considering where you are relative to the mean, you're just saying overall the variability of this group isn't that much.
Yeah, or maybe another way to answer this question, how long was the stimuli presented?
It was a long time, it was like a second.
Okay, so they had enough time to inspect each item, more or less, or at least a bunch of them.
To your point, I think if they did that, what it means then is they're disregarding the proximity to the mean, and they're looking at the variability of the set, perhaps. I mean, they could just be saying, okay, whenever there's a tight-knit group, I'm going to say I'm part of that, and I'm going to disregard the fact that the mean was further away from me. Know what I mean?
I'm trying to think if the mean being close or different would also impact the minimum item in this.
The minimum item? No, it wouldn't. If your response was right at the group mean, then, and if you're just looking at the two extremes, you would come up with the same calculation. The range is the same across the same mean and different mean conditions.
Okay, I'll think about it and talk to you later if I
There are
make it
some
coherent.
there are a couple of confounds in here. There's a couple issues, like just to be clear about it. Like if you have a really extreme response, then we can't put the group mean higher than your response, right? It's
Or
just
ceiling effect, basically.
so there are a couple of problems like that, and it may be that what you're asking about is something related to that, and if that's the case, then we should probably talk about it. But it's not a perfect. Relying on their response to produce the sets sort of restricted us in a way. I think Gideon's saying something maybe.
I'm trying to talk, sorry. There could be some sort of like jerk effect where if that jerk is in this group, I'm not going to be in it. And so there could be a maximal distance from any one individual that I'm willing to tolerate to belong to the group. And in the high variability, that minimum guy could be really far away from me, irrespective of the mean. If this group is willing to let this jerk in, it's not my group. And so in theory, you could come up with some tolerance range or something. And
I see. That would be especially true if you were one of the weaker responders, right? Whereas it'd be the opposite.
Or a particularly strong responder, right? I'm really outraged, and there's one guy who loves it. Oh, I can't tolerate that. That guy's not in my group.
Well, they never cross categories. So like your moral outrage would have to be at somebody who's neutral and not responding, but that can be a problem too. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff like that in here that we honestly I don't know the answer to that, but like and how much people are able to extract from these groups, we don't really know. We just know whether they said, are they my group or not, and that's it. That's all we got out of it. But that's interesting.
I guess one way to see that would be to see if a person that is very far away from your reaction would attract attention in any way.
Mm. We didn't do any sort of eye tracking here, if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, or some eye tracking, yes, or some sort of attention, some target that appears there, and just basically to see if that person who's very far away that could have outraged you because I can't be in the same group with this person who's so different from me, if that would have an effect.
Yeah, you hear that like on I watch a lot of reality TV, I'll admit it, okay? And then people always have this response, well, if you could be in love with that person, you couldn't possibly be in love, you know? And so people compare, they look at how people judge others and then they reflect that back onto themselves. And I think it's possible that there's something going on like that here. I think, I don't know if you could use eye tracking to look at, are they looking at the most angry faces? One thing that we did find was that people exaggerated. We had a separate task where they made judgments about a crowd, and that they amplified their estimates of anger in the crowds. And it's not just regression towards the mean either, or the middle of the response range. That they seem to be overestimating the anger and the outrage in the groups. But I don't know if it's just a couple of salient people driving that response or not. But that's interesting. Cool. Thank you. Okay, so what time do we have? What time is it?
It is 2:06 our time. We generally have it, give a full 2 hours. You don't have to take the full time if you don't want.
Okay. I threw in some extra stuff just in case. So I can do that in about 15 minutes. And then, yeah. Why don't I do just one more study? Okay. Oh, by the way, this works with happy expressions too, if you're wondering. It's not just an anger thing. The effect isn't quite as large, but the same pattern holds up. So it's not just about being pissed off at people, although those data are better. Let me bounce forward actually. Wait a minute. Okay, last study. This is something that's ongoing. It's not published yet. And it's based on some really old social psychology work. Some of the very first work in social psych is about how people act when they're in crowds. There's this old theory that people are more aggressive in crowds. It's called disindividuation. When you're part of a crowd, you become anonymous. And when you're granted that anonymity, all the horrible stuff that's deep inside your soul comes out, and then you act like a jerk and you do terrible things because you've escaped consequences and nobody knows who you are. I mean, that's a simplification, but that's the original idea. And it turns out that when you put people in small groups even, and you give people anonymity, depending on the extent to which they feel anonymous, people actually act a little bit more aggressively than they do when they're alone. And I'm not talking about like the peer review system here, although that's the first thing that comes to mind, right? But people do act a little bit more aggressively when they're in a crowd. It's possible that people know this. When people look at a crowd, people tend to afford individuals in a crowd less of a mind of their own. So if you see a crowd of people and then I say, hey, what about that person over there? What do you think about them? And you might be more likely to say that that person doesn't really have their own mind and that they're just doing whatever the crowd does. So people kind of have this lay theory, whether they know it explicitly or whether it's just implicit. People tend to know that people are a little bit more aggressive in crowds. They have that capacity. And just in terms of physical size and numbers, crowds have more potential to hurt you. And that's just logic, right? People have a hostile attribution bias when they see a face and they're unclear about what the expression on the face is. They're more likely to say that that person is threatening or angry. And that's perception of a single face. People think that might be something called error management, this separate line of theory, such that, well, if you're going to make a mistake about judging somebody's emotion, wouldn't you rather err in terms of saying somebody's threatening and then just patch up that relationship later? It's better to say, oh, I thought you were mad at me. You're not? Okay, we can be friends now, rather than to assume somebody is friendly when in fact they want to kick your ass, right? And so there's this really basic heuristic people probably engage when they see a single face and they don't know what the expression is. You're going to be biased to say that that face is threatening. We know this about individual faces. Now back to ensemble coding. Some of the results I showed you earlier show that people are really good at seeing emotion on faces. And in fact, there's other studies that show that when it comes to seeing crowds, people are just really good, better than they are at seeing individual faces. So I think that the field of ensemble coding is kind of painting this picture in which perception of crowds is always superior to individuals, and if not equivalent. Which sounds like people are pretty good at seeing crowds, right? But sensitivity is just half of the picture here. I don't know that anyone's really looked at bias when it comes to judgments of crowds. And crowds, like I said, have higher potential to harm you. And so when it comes to emotional judgments, people might be especially biased to make judgments about threat when they see ambiguity on expressions of crowds of faces. So we wanted to examine that. We thought that negative biases would be amplified when people see crowds of faces. And this is work done mostly by student Diana Mihalaka, who's a grad student in my lab now on a clinical internship at the University of Texas. We had a really simple design. So we showed people crowds of faces. We had different intensities of expression. We had 4 identities. They could be happy or they could be angry, but that's it. There's never any variability in the crowds at all. So for example, we might show one identity, a crowd of 12 faces, but all one identity and 80% happy. Or maybe in another trial, there's a crowd of faces they're all 20% angry, right? The crowds are no different than the single faces, aside from the fact that there's just more faces. That's it. No variability, nothing like that. We show a crowd really fast, and then we just ask people, were they happy or angry? Simple binary response. And we look at sensitivity using D prime and criterion, bias using C. And if you look on the left, okay, as expressive intensity increases, as the faces have more intensity on them, people are better at saying whether they're happy or angry. Fine, good. People are better at judgments of crowds than single faces, just because there's more faces. That's it. Could be like a redundancy gain kind of thing, or a probability summation. There's lots of, it might not be ensemble coding, I don't know, but people are better at seeing crowds than single faces. So that's all right. But what was really interesting to us was what's going on here on the right. A negative criterion value means that people are more liberal in endorsing the presence of anger. So they have an anger bias across the board, regardless of the intensity. They're more biased to say if the faces are angry, if they're low intensity. So the less they know about what's actually there, the more biased they are to say they're negative. And if they see the faces in the context of a crowd, that negative bias is amplified further here. You can break this down in terms of hits and false alarms. And what you see in the left, phone's going off here, the top left graph here, each dot represents one observer's responses and a combination of hit rate and false alarm. So dots that are to the right of the solid black line indicate that they have an anger bias. They're liberal in terms of saying there's anger. And then dots that are to the left of the dashed line indicate that they have a positive D prime value, meaning they're good perceivers. So you can see that these people, just in this condition, we had 90 people, their anger bias, and it's especially so when they're not perceiving very well. And then once they get better at the task, the dots sort of converge at the upper left corner. There actually isn't a whole lot of room for anger bias to materialize in that case. So the results kind of have to converge. Eventually they'll get down to 0, because when you have perfect sensitivity, you can't have any bias at all. The point here is that uncertainty brings out this anger bias that people have. Even though they're good at the task, when they're not, they become super biased with crowds. So seeing crowds doesn't necessarily make you a great perceiver. It can actually make you more biased. We show that this is just not a result of seeing low intensity expressions. If you show a medium intensity expression, but just occlude the faces with a bunch of gray, pixel noise, the more occlusion there is, the more the bias comes out. So it's just a matter of not being able to see and make a good perceptual decision. That's a heuristic. That's why this comes out the way it does. The number of faces really matters. It's not just a simple linear amplification of the anger bias depending on how many people there are. We went up to 24 faces, and what we found was that the bias peaks at 4 faces and then it just sort of flattens out, which actually makes some sense. There's some really old work by Milgram. What they did was they would show this is a real experiment. So they would have Confederates, and then they would just have these people standing on the sidewalk, and they would have they would wait for somebody to walk down the sidewalk, and one of the Confederates would turn and look at something, and they would measure how likely the unwitting participant would be to turn and look in that same direction as a function of how many Confederates in the group looked off at that point in space. And as more people turn and look at something at the same time, the more likely you are to look at that thing too. But it maxes out at about 4 or 5. And then having, 10 or 20 extra people really doesn't buy you any additional, pull. So based on that, we actually predicted, this is one of those things that it's too good to be true. We predicted that it would peak at 4, and that's exactly what happened. So I don't know, I'll take it for once, It's not just a general negativity bias either. We had another experiment where we had crowds of angry and fearful faces. So it wasn't just a positive, negative task. And people still had a bias to respond angry, even when they could have said fearful. So it's something about anger specifically and not just a generic negativity bias. And then the last thing, this is something that we did just this winter before everything sort of shut down. We had some good luck. We finished this the week before our lab closed up. We wanted to unpack the bias a little bit more. We know that people are, when they see a crowd, more biased to press. I mean, what are they doing? They're pressing pressing a button and saying angry. They're biased to press that button. What does that actually mean? Like a lot has to happen cognitively and perceptually before you pick up your hand and go like that, right? So is it a cognitive bias? Is it just a response bias? Is it a change in the decision-making process? Did the faces actually look angrier to participants? Is it a matter of perceptual processing? Like, how do you unpack that? So for that, we turn to drift division. And what this is if you're not familiar with it, it's what you do is you have a task where you ask people to respond. My internet's cutting out here. You all hear me still? Good. Okay. So you have a task where you ask people to respond as soon as they're confident making a decision about what they're seeing. And you have to leave, it's best to leave the stimuli up on the screen indefinitely, because what you're doing is you're measuring the rate at which perceivers accumulate information about whatever it is on the screen. And then you're trying to estimate how they accumulate that information and then get past some sort of internal decision threshold that they have. And so what you can do is you look at their distributions of reaction times, specifically for correct trials and incorrect trials. And you can unpack their bias into different component processes. And the key ones we cared about were one's called starting value. And that's really just the response bias that somebody comes into an experiment with. As the trial begins, before I even really know what I'm looking at, I'm just more likely to press angry. And maybe that's possible. So you can measure that with starting bias. Another is what's called accumulation rate or drift. And that is how quickly and efficiently a perceiver accumulates information about whatever's on the screen. The more efficiently you process something, the more quickly you accumulate. And then the last parameter that we cared about, there's some other ones, but the last one we cared about was what's called boundary separation or threshold. So you have this internal threshold that you must accumulate information past in order to make a decision. And that could either be the correct or incorrect decision. If you narrow that boundary separation, what you get is a speed accuracy trade-off. You pass the boundary faster, but you make more errors. And imagine the top and bottom of my little screen here. You start off here, and then you can accumulate information, right? Either towards the correct response up here, or towards the incorrect response down here. Your starting value biases you in one direction or the other. So let's say the correct response is anger. If my starting value is biased towards anger, then as I begin the accumulation process, I'm going to get to that angry response faster, right? And then accumulation rate really matters. Oops. Okay, so you can accumulate really quick, and if you make the boundary separation shorter, you're going to get to responses much quicker. You can be more conservative by spreading out that boundary separation, making it less likely you accidentally get to the incorrect response. drift rate really matters a lot too. And last, there's going to be internal noise in the process. So like maybe you're accumulating, right, towards the correct response, but there's a lot of internal noise and you might just randomly end up at the wrong decision. So what this model does is it allows you to just get these different parameter estimates for these different components of bias. And we could figure out, while doing our signal detection approach, what those different parameters were. And what we found, I can show you a table, but who wants to look at a table? So I just tell you, what we find is that everybody has a starting bias to say anger. And when the expressions are lower intensity, which is something you can tell right at the beginning of the trial, your anger starting value bias increases further. So if the trial starts and you really don't know what you're looking at, already you're biased to say anger. Second, people, not surprisingly, accumulate information about high intensity faces faster than low intensity. So that's sort of like a sanity check there, that worked. People accumulate information about angry faces more quickly than happy faces. So they're more efficient processors of anger. They process, the drift rate for crowds is greater than single faces. So people process information on angry crowds faster than happy crowds, especially when those crowds are high intensity. When faces are also low intensity, people are terrible at accumulating information about happy crowds. They just gather information, they gather it, and they just don't really seem to get anywhere. And it's that combination of a bias, a starting cognitive bias towards anger to begin with, and then really poor perception of low intensity crowds that pushes people to make false alarms and report that happy crowds are in fact angry crowds when they don't know what they're looking at. And so that's the latest incarnation of this research, which has been really fun, because I'll be honest, that this whole bias question was driving me crazy. Years couldn't figure out how to unpack it, and this model really helps with that. All right. So a few parting thoughts. What did Jerry Springer say? He has like a minute where he sums it all up at the end. Jason Haberman knows what I'm talking about.
Final thoughts.
Final thoughts. Yeah, thanks, Steve. A true friend. All right. Lots of social theory, decades of theory provides insights into what makes a collection of people a group, not just faces or anonymous eggs on the screen, but a collective of people can be an actual group of people with shared values. These cues, whatever they are, may be perceptual. Right? When we see a face, we make an assumption about what somebody's internal state is, and this information is available at a super rapid time scale, and it's available to you as a perceiver via ensemble coding, and you can use that to make then more complex cognitive inferences about what a group of people is thinking and doing. So I think that ensemble coding appears then to like scaffold really complex judgments about groups, and maybe even your own membership within those groups. And in general, I just want to mention again how neat it's been collaborating with social psychologists who've been really helpful to me and helping me to refine my ideas and sort of really use theory to refine the way I do my experiments and ask questions. I think it's been a really neat process for me. All right, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
You're welcome.
Where's Bill? Bill, you want to lead us?
Oh, you're muted. Yeah, we couldn't hear Bill's clap. Oh,
Christina, you might need to unmute Bill.
Is he talking?
Okay, here he is.
okay.
He's just saying good job over and over again. I can't read lips, but I think that's
Yes, I'm saying
That's what I read.
it's a good job, but there's always exactly about 3/4 of a second between when I clap and when you clap. But that makes sense because it has to go around the world before you see me do something.
Okay.
Questions? Okay. Well, Christina, do you want to? I have a question, but maybe we want to stop the recording now since it's probably more than long enough.
okay.